can actually get started with our event now. Welcome to today's Project Lotus webinar, Navigating Cultural Identity. I hope everyone's week has been going well, and we're super excited to share today's resource. Just to give some context, happy AAPI Heritage Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. Those were kind of the reasons we wanted to provide this topic on this webinar today. And especially living in America, many of us in the AAPI community may face cultural challenges, difficulties balancing our bicultural identity, and especially for youth, these things can become even harder to deal with, whether it be at school, with their peers, experiencing that bicultural experience in America. And especially for youth, as we're growing, we don't have to grow, but we have to develop as people while balancing that cultural identity. So just to start off, we will begin with a quick introduction to Project Lotus, and then a keynote presentation from an amazing speaker today, as well as a quick, or I wouldn't say quick, panel discussion among our audience. Oh, sorry, not audience, panelists, my mistake. So we wanted to host this webinar because, we really feel like in the AAPI community, it's great to tackle these challenges holistically by getting these resources, not just to youth, not just to parents, but in a way that we can work together to address this stigma. And that also ties into Project Lotus and why we were founded. So I see a lot of repeat attendees here. So I just wanted to quickly introduce Project Lotus for anyone new. But we are a completely youth-led organization dedicated to destigmatizing mental health in the AAPI community. This event is also youth-led. We do this for every event, but if some of the Project Lotus people also want to turn on their cameras just to say hello, for repeat viewers, these are the same background people who have been bringing you these webinars. A moment to do that. But there we go. So we got Arushi and Joshua G, who are two background people today helping us out with this webinar. And we offer resources to the community, as you can see, whether it be education, so webinars like these that are culturally relevant, support resources. We actually have a kind of a community support group for youth going on right now. If you're interested in that, you can check out our website for more information. And then we also have educational resources, whether it be on our social media. We have some new interesting resource projects coming up soon this summer, so stay on the lookout for that. If you're interested in any of these things, please check out our website and social media, or feel free to email us as well. In addition, though we're youth-led, like I said, we want to work with the community. If you're interested in joining our mission and fighting stigma with us, we have positions available for youth to work with us, as well as parents, mental health professionals. Really, anyone in the community, just check out our website. We have volunteer forms for both those options. Lastly, we plug this for each webinar, but if you'd like to join our community WeChat, here's that QR code, as always. I'll leave that up quickly if you'd like to screenshot that and maybe scan that later. Awesome. And without further ado, I want to give the most time to our panelists and speakers. So if I get the next slide, please. I'd like to introduce Dr. Josephine Kim. Dr. Kim is on the faculty at Harvard University, and especially with that video, I think it highlights the importance of communication when it comes to navigating these cultural differences, as well as in the context of all those differences you mentioned and outlined. I hope this was helpful to the audience. So now we'll move on to our amazing student panelists. If you want to turn your cameras now. To Arushi, I think we can go ahead and not share the slide for this one. We can just get straight into it. But panelists, thank you so much again for your courage and being open to sharing your experiences. We're so excited to have you today. First, we have Anwesha Mukherjee. Onwaisha is a first year at Stanford University majoring in computer science. She's recently become a board member for the Stanford South Asian Society, but her relationship with her cultural identity has been tumultuous. She recognizes how difficult it is to be a hyphenated American and wants to help others overcome the same challenges. We also have Selena Shen. Selena is from a small suburb outside of Boston, Massachusetts. After graduating from Worcester Academy, she's excited to attend Boston College in the coming fall. She's looking forward to using her experience as an Asian American born Chinese to share her story and bring awareness to mental health as it relates to Asian American culture. Again, thank you so much, panelists, and I'll just hand it off to you. Could you first just start off with giving your experiences in the context of this webinar, this topic, and how it relates to mental health for you? Onwaisha, would you like to start first?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so I grew up recognizing really quickly that I actively fell under a really common South Asian phrase, which is American born, confused they see, in that I was both disconnected from my culture, but also very unsure of how to feel capable of being truly Indian. I went to a school originally that was predominantly white, and even when we did have a larger Asian population, I remember feeling like a very tokenized Indian, understanding that our school liked to celebrate Diwali so that we could bring in our quote unquote costumes. And even my skin color was enough to make me recognize how I stood out. And seeing how it felt like it kept me disconnected from communities at school, I did everything I could to essentially reject that. And as Dr. Kim mentioned, I did exactly what she said. I learned to code switch very quickly until I started to completely change my framework and mindset to being that of a much more westernized perspective, to a point where I started rejecting what it meant to be Asian American. And it was something I struggled with all throughout elementary school, building through middle school. And I only started to really realize that I wanted to reclaim my cultural identity when I recognized how important it was to have it be a part of me for the sake of my own mental strength. And I was really grateful to my parents in that they gave me a lot of liberty to choose how I went about reclaiming my Indian identity, from things ranging from our faith and how I wanted to respect my faith, that there wasn't necessarily a means of being a bad Hindu if I did things differently, to evaluating what was my passion and not having expectations on me. I think there was a lot in which most of my issues were based on pushing back on stereotypes. And so having the opportunity to simply choose and embrace my personality and combine that with whatever made sense for me culturally was really important. Before finding a larger shared community in middle school and high school, I found much larger Asian American communities, and being able to be around students with shared cultural experiences and have conversations about being the hyphenated American was really important. And ultimately, it boiled down to recognizing that it was kind of okay to have a cultural identity that was in that limbo. I didn't have to be in the binary of either Indian or American. I could be a hyphenated Indian American student, and there was a lot to learn from that within student communities.
Thank you so much, Onwaisha. Selena, would you like to share?
Yeah, so first of all, hi, my name is Selena. So similar to Anwesha, I went to the same middle school, private middle school and high school, which was also predominantly white. I was actually really the only ABC, the American-born Chinese girl, really the only person in my grade that kind of fell into that category. And because of that, it was pretty hard for me to find someone that I really connected with and related to. And I think a huge thing in general for middle school and early high school is the ability to fit in and to be well liked and to be quote unquote popular. And I think this is actually one of the main reasons why adolescents and children end up losing a bit of their cultural identity, is because they want to try to fit in and to be well liked. And at least for me, to try to fit in better, I would try to act more white in front of my friends by completely ignoring the fact that I had an Asian culture. And I think another layer to that was also like at home, my parents we weren't a super duper traditional family. So they didn't really super enforce like the Asian culture on me either. So I think because of that, I kind of strayed away from kind of like my heritage culture. And I didn't really realize that until I traveled to China a few years ago. And I realized I didn't really fit in well there either. Like, even though I looked Asian, like on the surface, it didn't seem like I fit in well there either. And it, what really shocked me was that even amongst my own family members, they seemed to they would laugh at my kind of like my American ways and kind of my ability to not speak Chinese that well. And like, while I understand it comes from like a good and loving place, it was still kind of like a shock to me. I didn't really fit in. And I think as a result, like I didn't feel like I could call myself Chinese without, I feel like, doing a disservice, I guess, to the rest of the Chinese community. But I also didn't see myself as kind of like a pure American. And I think that this was mainly kind of the issue through middle school, early high school. But things like, as time passed, I actually was able to find avenues to try to like bridge the disconnect between my Chinese roots. And similar to like Onwaisha mentioned, her parents gave her a lot of freedom, so did my parents. So I took the liberty myself to kind of like relearn Chinese and try to get more connected with the language, and that way I could actually speak to my family more. Like, for example, I could speak to more easily to my grandparents, and at home I would actually try to force myself to try to speak the language even if my grandparents weren't around. And one of the big things actually that helped me a lot was that starting in sophomore year, I actually started volunteering at this Chinese culture and language school. And basically the targeted audience were kids like me, like elementary/middle school age students that were Chinese kids growing up in America that are from like a Chinese family. And that actually helped me a lot because I was able to connect with people that were similar to me by also kind of like providing experience that I wasn't able to have as a child. So for me, I realized that it's really important to kind of like find those communities that kind of resonate with you and kind of give back to those. And that actually helped me a lot to kind of bridge the gap between like the differences.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I think a lot of audience too can resonate with, even though it's oftentimes individualized, unique ways we can all connect to our own cultural identity and navigate that. It looks like that came from both Onwaisha and Selena as a common theme of finding those ways that work for you to navigate that. So thank you so much again, panelists, for bravely sharing your experiences and kind of how that ties into cultural identity and mental health. So now I think we'll just go straight into an open Q&A panel discussion. So if all panelists want to turn on their cameras and mics, just a quick note to attendees as well. If you'd like to direct your questions to the Q&A box, we'd love to take them. You can also ask anonymously if you prefer. But panelist you haven't seen today is Shubh Agrawal. Ms. Agrawal is a school counselor in Worcester, Massachusetts, and a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Education in the Prevention Science and Practice and CES programs. She centers her work as a counselor on strength-based practice and the intersectionality of the identities and experiences of students and their faculty and staff. Thank you so much, Ms. Agrawal, for joining us today. But I guess I'll open it up. If anyone would like to drop their questions into the Q&A box, we'd love to direct them to our panelists. You can also specify if a certain panelist you'd like to have answer them, that works as well. And I guess in the meantime, as those questions come in, I want to kind of leave this as an open question to both to panelists and speakers, is that, we've seen a common theme today of how identifying with one culture over the other is not necessarily better than the other, but more it's that point of navigating it. So how can either parents or if youth want to respond with what parents should spot, how can parents spot when that challenge is happening, when youth are having that challenge navigating their cultural identity?
Shubh, we haven't heard from you, so I'd love to hear from you first.
That's a really great question, Daniel. I feel like for a lot of my students, there's a lot of conflict that kind of arises, and it can be about a lot of different things. Students I've talked to, my goodness, have mentioned conflict around grades when grades start coming up, or college, or how to spend extracurricular activities, and things just kind of start feeling more tense. And usually there's a lot of questions that we can start asking at that point, but oftentimes I'll talk to families about what kinds of questions are coming up, because oftentimes what we see on the surface of behavior, there's often so much going on beneath the surface. And so I tend to find myself talking about, what fitting in and affinity groups and what are we doing to kind of make them feel kind of, as Selena and Onwaisha mentioned, kind of connected to folks then. So I would say look out for some conflict going on, because there's usually a lot more going on under the surface than what the fight might actually be about right then.
Student panelists, maybe if you want to share your perspective, things you'd like parents to spot.
Okay, I can go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Kim.
Oh, no, please do go ahead. Want to hear from you.
Okay. I think something that was really valuable with my parents, beyond them just giving me liberty, was them being very attentive to choices they made with my older sister and really taking advantage of what they saw with that and trying to learn from that in how they gave me an opportunity to explore my identity. And one of the biggest things they always did was recognize when I wasn't enjoying something. As frivolous as it seemed on instinct, there were parts of our cultural identity that felt almost expected of being an Indian girl who went to temple and who participated in all these community events. And some of them were even different styles of Indian dance, expecting I'd want to do one of them, or some form of classical singing and training. And I personally didn't enjoy them. And it was difficult to admit to that for a long time, because it wasn't just uniquely about my cultural identity, but more so something of, this wasn't the way I felt connected. It didn't feel authentic to me. And that made it more difficult when others that I could look at were connected so deeply to what their sense of Indian identity was based on certain activities, and I wasn't doing the same thing. And my parents recognizing that and looking for different ways for me to feel more connected, looking for opportunities, events, anything where I enjoyed it, and letting me explore that process was really important to me, feeling like I had more autonomy, and simultaneously without denying my presence as Indian.
So that point on validation and supporting, but not really boxing in you to kind of one specific direction they want you to take. Thank you for sharing. Any other panelists like to add anything?
That's amazing. And first, I really enjoyed listening to the student panelists. So thank you for everything you shared. I think the only thing I might add, Daniel, is I just want to normalize it for parents that your children will go through the identity confusion. It is such a process. And so don't feel like, if they go through that, and more than likely they will, that you did something wrong, or that, it's an emergency. More than likely, I mean, this is just a part of the process of trying to fit into two cultures, right? And understand who you are and where you fit in between the two worlds. And so I just wanted to normalize that it's very normal and ordinary that your children will go through that. And even if they don't feel that connection to your heritage culture that you really want them to have, trust me, it's coming. Usually around college age is when they dig deeper into their own heritage. And this is where we begin to see, like, kids who didn't even speak the language sing all those like heritage songs and rap to them and eat nothing but their cultural foods and etc. And so it's such a process. Again, just be patient. That time is coming.
Absolutely, yeah. To validate all the parents in the audience is not your fault. You're doing great, and coming to this webinar too to hear these topics too, I think is amazing to see. Yeah.
I think also to highlight something Dr. Kim talked about in her presentation is communication. I think that is extremely important for parents to see like how their child is feeling. Like, it doesn't have to be like anything super deep. You could just like at the end of when they come home from school, just say, oh, how did your day go? What happened? Like, that's actually something my parents did do a lot, right? For me, is at the end of every day during dinner, we all kind of sit together and they're just like, how was your day? What happened? And then like, because like your kids, like just for the parents, like your kids, like they trust you. So even if there's kind of like a shell, like at the beginning when you first ask them, like the more you ask, like more things will come out, because they're your kids still look up to you as a model. So they want to like tell you about things. And I think that kind of communication is really important. And I think to like build up of that, like parents get a much better kind of viewpoint of how the child is feeling and like how they feel they fit in challenges like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that point of communication too. I remember Dr. Kim had that one picture. It was like, have you eaten yet? And then the response was, I love you too. And, I think that communication point is so important in our community, especially when sometimes we miss that point. But for parents and youth to recognize that sometimes the way we communicate is different, that parents and youth still love each other. We do have one question in the chat I'd like to get to. It says, what does reclaiming and embracing our Asian identity look like as we go through school, become working professionals? Maybe if student panelists want to take this, what has that looked like for you? For professionals, maybe what have you seen with youth you've worked with?
Honestly, Daniel, I think the addendum you put to the question, what does it look like for you? That for you was almost really crucial in my mind, because I don't think there is any singular archetype of what reclaiming one's cultural identity could ever be. I think a lot of it comes down to a personal journey and kind of understanding your narrative, where you're at and what you need, what is good for you and what is valuable for you, to be able to recognize different aspects of your culture, including things that you might not have kept for me, a lot of reclaiming was more so rooted in things like language, which I had a lot of regrets about choosing not to learn or choosing to avoid. And with not being able to speak in my mother tongue fluently or very comfortably with family back in India, that was really difficult for me to come back and reckon with as I grew older. And I realized it wasn't something I enjoyed. And I didn't enjoy having to be the one who made the rest of my family switch to English when they could. And some of them couldn't do that. And a lot of that came back to my desire for being connected to my family. And that was just a unique incident. But in doing so, it also made me feel much more comfortable with the languages, realizing this was something for myself. And it was something that was under my control. And I had the choice to do it. I had the choice to improve it. And so I think reclamation as a process is really about that individual choice and process that can be through any procedures. It can be through anything you do. When I joined Stanford SAS, I knew it wasn't going to be something where I automatically was going to be quote unquote more Indian or know more about Bollywood films than a bunch of the people who were in the group. It was all about having a community where we would have random shared experiences and random unique perspectives together. And the conversations would allow us to have an understanding of one another that would also let us reclaim parts of that identity. And for me, that's been really valuable in this past year. So my process wasn't really any singular isolated procedure. It wasn't even a joint process in a lot of ways. So I think reclamation really is unique to the individual and being more in tune with yourself than anything else.
That's a good point. Yeah. Any other panelists like to follow up?
You know, it's so important for us too to think about the outside factors that really push on our communities, right? So, I mean, you can't reclaim something you don't even know you had or should be there, right? And so many of us who are educated in the United States, we go through an entire K through 16 education, often never seeing ourselves in the curriculum, never reading anything that was written by people like us, about us, for us, right? And when that's the case, you don't even know that that should have been the case. And so this is where I say, you know, United States, the education we're placing our children under is really an assimilationist education, which is they're trying to remove, right, any cultural heritage that our children bring to the schools. And it's often by default. It's not like they're intending to do it, but by default, because it's erased, it doesn't exist, it's not presented to us. Unfortunately, the messaging that we get growing up in this nation is that, you know, the messaging I got was, you know, people who look like you don't write books. And even if they did, it's not valuable enough to put it in the curriculum and have you read it, right? And so if that's the messaging we get for so long, unfortunately, we begin to internalize things, meaning that becomes a part of how we see ourselves, right? And so I mention all of this to say, reclaiming ourselves, right? You can't understand who you are now without understanding your full history. And so one of the ways that we can reclaim our cultural identity is to really get a full understanding of Asian America, Asian American history, ethnic studies, like where the community has been, what's been done to us. Many things they don't associate with Asian Americans are things like histories of massacres, lynchings, right? They don't associate borders around the United States with Asian Americans, but all of those things did happen to our groups. And so a strong kind of plug for, you know, definitely dig into the history, understand the contributions AAPI folks have made to the infrastructure of this nation, that they were key vital things that our communities did. It wouldn't be what it is today without us, right? And this is one way to reclaim our cultural identity.
Absolutely, yeah, the point about how educating and getting to really understand that identity in our history is absolutely an important point. I guess, Ms. Agrawal, in your experience at schools working with students, have you seen how that, you know, if your school is like, or I guess in your experience with schools, if successfully educating and raising awareness has played a key role in youth accepting their cultural identity?
Yeah, I think it's a journey, as you know, Dr. Kim mentions. I think there's a lot of work that we can still be doing in terms of our curriculum, our history curriculum, our English curriculum. I talk to a lot of students every year who read one book that features a South Asian. It is written by a South Asian author, but you know, it just features, you know, storylines of incest and storylines that just feel really kind of reductive. And a lot of my South Asian students are like, this is not who we are, but because it's the one book we read by a South Asian author, now every single person in my class is asking me questions about like how common this practice is. So I think we need to really look at a lot of these curriculum and read more, as Dr. Kim mentions, a much more diverse, inclusive curriculum. And to the point, I think a lot of my students, I know, for example, I was the first South Asian faculty person at my school, my goodness. And so there is definitely much more work we can do in bringing much more representation into our schools. I know a big thing that we're doing at my school is creating affinity groups for students, just creating spaces for them to connect over lunch and not necessarily create a curriculum, but just a space for them to realize, like, I'm not alone in this process. And kind of to Onwaisha's point, there's so much that can happen even before college in terms of that journey. And not every single student is part of it, but those who want to have that space every week. So those are a couple of things I'm seeing, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I guess that's a good point too for parents in the audience or youth, like seeking out those resources offered by schools, local organizations can be a great way for youth or even just any API members, community members to get the chance to reconnect. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So it looks like we're actually coming a little close to kind of wrapping up this webinar. So I guess I want to end the webinar with, if every panelist wants to give just a quick message to the audience, whether it, kind of on the topic of a message of support or kind of advice, right? Whether it's for its parent, what you'd like to see parents do, or support youth. Could you give like a quick final message to the audience, starting maybe with Onwaisha, and then we'll just go down the list.
Yeah, I think something I was really grateful for ultimately with my Asian identity is at some point realizing it wasn't necessarily something that had to be quiet as well. I could be really proud of my capacity, even with recognizing that visibility can be dangerous. And I had events happen to me that proved that there were issues with being Asian in the US, even in the status quo. I think the past year and a half has made it glaringly apparent how difficult it can be to be so visibly different, even by something like your skin color. But despite that, I think a lot of times what students need then is to recognize there is a form of solidarity in these lived experiences and in these shared experiences, and having the opportunity to come home to their family and figure out what it means to express themselves in all of those capacities, and not necessarily recognize their cultural identity as something that has to be distinguished from the rest of their identity, but rather another part of their identity is really valuable. And it's something that I would emphasize is perhaps the most important part of how I really realized what I wanted in being Indian American, because the reality was a lot of the values I learned at home, a lot of what I did see why I do believe that I probably will be Hindu for the rest of my life, and the faith I developed there, the structures of language, all of these values, they do persist in every other part of my life. And I think that was really important to me. And that's something that is completely acceptable. And a lot of the time is something that there are values that are universal and they might simply be expressed differently. And so recognizing that cultural identity, recognizing that there will always be people on their side, no matter how they choose to claim those parts of their identity, is really, really helpful, really valuable, and really reassuring in a way that prevents a lot of the issues with mental health that I think go undercovered and under-recognized, because non-Asian individuals won't even know how to see that.
Selena, did you have a quick message of advice to parents or youth in the audience too?
Yeah, so kind of just adding on to what Onwaisha said, I think, at least for me, I realized, like, despite all the struggles that we kind of highlighted today, or we talked about today, I think it's definitely a blessing, like having kind of like being like kind of the biculturalism. I think it's really a blessing, because the process of reclaiming it is when you really like kind of discover yourself. And if you hadn't really had that kind of challenge to begin with, you wouldn't have gone through the kind of like the reclaiming and rediscovering process. So despite all the challenges, I still definitely think it's definitely a blessing.
Thank you. Dr. Kim?
Yes, so I'm going to use some strong language here, parents. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Again, by default, our US education system and schools are going to mute our heritage culture in many ways, just because it is missing from our students and what they can practice and what they can be exposed to in the schools. That actually means then as parents that we need to do that part, right? So when we think about being prideful, like being very proud of our culture. Again, we need to present as many counter narratives and counter experiences to our children that really counteracts the stereotypical things that they might be exposed to, and the realities they're going to live. And also just again, a reiteration of it is a long process. And so don't expect, they're going to get it or they might change overnight. It is a long process. When in doubt though, conversations, always come back to the conversations.
Awesome. Ms. Agrawal?
Yeah, I guess in honor of, honoring everything that's been shared already, my only thing I could add is in honor of, Mental Health Awareness Month and AAPI Month. I am such a big advocate for mental health resources, and that can look like so many different things. It can look like a conversation with a loved one. It can look like a conversation with a counselor or a therapist. And so I'd encourage, if you're a student here, if you're an adult here, ask so many questions about mental health resources. We can find something that works for you. I know so many of my students have benefited from just having a conversation with one of the counselors, and helping them to navigate all of these stressors. So we can get through this together. I just thought I'd throw a plug in. And so please ask us questions. We're here to help.
Awesome. Then thank you so much, panelists. And yeah, I'd like to add on too, for audience members, like there are professionals who are trained and their expertise is this topic in cultural identity. So please, use the resources out there. And with that, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. If we get the last slide up, please. But thank you again to Dr. Kim for sharing your expertise today, as well as Ms. Agrawal for experiences, and student panelists as well for having the courage to come and speak, share your perspective. I'm sure this was a very educational webinar, a resource for a lot of the parents and even youth or anyone in the audience today. So I just want to wrap up with some quick announcements. Please be on the lookout for our next webinar next month on the 26th for Pride Month. In addition, if you'd like to check out any more information about Project Lotus or about the webinar, the recording of the Q&A will be available on our website. Lastly, here again is that community WeChat. Just as a quick thing, for API Heritage Month, we are doing a virtual conference and campaign for a couple of organizations, including Project Lotus. So if you'd like to support that fundraiser, that will be in the chat real quickly. If one of our backend people could send that. But with that, I want to say thank you again so much for attending today's webinar. And I hope with this was helpful. And thank you so much, everyone who is taking this step to hear out these amazing panelists and speakers. Hope you all have a good day.